All right. Hi, everyone. Really a pleasure to be here presenting today. Thank you very much, Courtney, Amy, and Charlie for the invitation. Really nice setting that you have here with the presentation before the conference. So today, the title of my talk is a question, and the question is low energy availability a concern for runners' health and performance? There's really no straightforward answer to this question, but I'm going to try to tackle the answer to this question today by dividing my talk in 3 different parts, if my slides work. There we go. So in part number 1, we're going to look a little bit at the epidemiological data on some health concerns in runners and the links potentially to low energy availability. In part number 2, we're going to be looking a little bit at the sort of links between energy deficit, performance, and skeletal muscle adaptation. And in part number 3, we're going to be looking at concerns beyond energy deficit, as we believe that maybe there's been too much emphasis put on the negative effects of low energy availability. So let's go part number 1 first, and let's look at some important sort of health concerns in male and female runners. We're going to focus on 2 main ones, which are bone stress injuries and reproductive system dysfunction, mainly in females. So bone stress injuries are the most common serious illness in endurance runners, and the prevalence is typically between 10 and 20%. Depends on the population that you're focusing, but this is the sort of normal number. There's cumulative risk factors like having had a previous bone stress injury, having low bone mineral density, low energy availability with either an eating disorder or disordered eating, and low body mass index. 3 of these points are thought of being directly related to low energy availability, like the 3 at the bottom. And then we have to focus on the reproductive system dysfunction. Typically, we look at the incidence of amenorrhea, which is the lack of a normal menstrual cycle in females. We focus specifically on what is called like secondary or hypothalamic amenorrhea. And the incidence in athletic population is being reported to be in a sort of relatively early study between 1 and 44%, which is a lot higher than in the general population, that is between 2 and 5%. When we look at specifically in runners, the combination of oligomenorrhea, which is the irregular menstrual cycles, and amenorrhea is being reported to be around 28% in sort of amateur collegiate runners, and then in professional or elite runners, the prevalence is really, really high. It's been reported to be 38% of oligomenorrhea and 25% of amenorrhea. So the cumulative incidence of reproductive system dysfunction that is accessible like in a sort of clinical way is like 63%. So really, really high prevalence. So, we have like 2 quite outstanding problems here that we need to know what the problem is about. And what's being thought, the source of the problem, well, you guessed it right, is being thought to be low energy availability. So in the late 90s, there was this female athlete triad proposed where low energy availability is thought as the cause of menstrual dysfunction in females and hypogonadism in males. That's a bit more recent, and also have a direct effect on bone metabolism, producing osteoporosis, which eventually would lead to a bone stress injury in runners. So what is energy availability? To go, through it like quite briefly, I could talk about this for a few hours, but I'm going to keep it to 1 slide. And broadly speaking, we can say that energy availability is the energy necessary for our physiology to maintain its normal physiological function. And it's defined as the energy intake minus exercise energy expenditure normalized by fat-free mass. This gives us a value of energy availability in kilocalories per kilo of fat-free mass per day. But we're going to say, well, what is low energy availability, or how we achieve low energy availability simply by either reducing energy intake, increasing exercise energy expenditure, or a combination of both, with the idea that in the general sort of athletic population, there is sort of an inadvertent decrease in energy availability that leads to sort of negative outcomes, as I was mentioning before. And we've studied sort of rather systematically all the literature looking at the causal effects between low energy availability and its sort of endocrine, metabolic, and physiological factors. In this review we published a few years ago to show that it's quite clear that low energy availability does indeed have a clear effect in different endocrine axes. For example, first of all, there's a very clear effect on decreasing body mass by low energy availability. There's a reduction in T3, so it affects the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. It affects the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis as well, changing hormones that would predict cessation of the menstrual cycle. And there's also very clear effect on markers of bone formation and resorption, whereby it reduces markers of bone formation and increases markers of bone resorption, like P1NP and so on. So actually, there are markers of collagen synthesis and resorption, so they're not exclusive to bone. So based on this data, the data that I was describing before is based mainly on short-term studies, because these studies are very difficult to control. So studies that typically last between 3 to 5 days in very well-controlled conditions. That gives us an idea of what happened at the early stages in the sort of endocrine response to low energy. There's been this thing called the relative energy deficiency in sport model proposed by combining some of these laboratory-based data with a lot of observational data in athletes. And there's been an update of the consensus statement published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine 2023. And basically, in this model, there's this idea that low energy availability sits at the center of this wheel, where it's the cause of a lot of different negative effects. Well, I don't think you can see much there. The size of the screen probably doesn't allow for that. But you can see there's things as reproductive function and bone metabolism that, they have fairly good mechanistic data to support those ideas, to things that don't really have much mechanistic data supporting that it happens as a consequence of low energy availability, for example, like urinary incontinence or like depression, or there's a whole range of things that are thought to be affected by low energy availability. Where basically in this model there's been causality inferred from epidemiological or like observational data, largely using low energy availability as sole etiological factor. So if we look at this model, then we think that there's a cause at the center, and outside this sort of wheel, there's all these like consequences, all negative. So based on this idea, then I think there's a bit of a black and white type thinking, whereby energy balance is thought as a good thing, and low energy availability is thought as a negative thing. Which takes us to the second part of the talk, which is energy deficit performance and skeletal muscle adaptation. So I think it's important to remember that we as humans are basically adapted to be hunter-gatherers. Our physiology hasn't really changed much from what's been adapted to in the African savanna, where we adapted to be how we are, and we are basically adapted to run in this, which being clearly delineated in this landmark study published in 2004 by Professor Brambles and Lieberman. And the idea that we're also adapted for persistent hunting and scavenging is being quite well supported in the literature, in more recent research, sort of supporting the idea that we're not only adapted to be able to run long distances, but also do so in conditions where the availability of food has not been optimal. So we're basically adapted to survive in environments where we don't have the optimal, or what we would think is optimal energy availability. There is this really interesting study looking also in top Kenyan runners' degree of energy deficit prior to competition. This study published in the British Journal of Nutrition in 2006 followed a group of elite Kalenjin Kenyan runners prior to competitions, which they were in peak condition, and did an assessment of energy intake and exercise energy expenditure over 7 days using double-labeled water. Without going into the details of this figure, which shows the energy expenditure here and the energy intake, anything that is sort of in the red triangle indicates that individuals were in some sort of energy deficit throughout this period, which was relatively mild, but led on average to a 0.3 kilo weight loss on a 7-day period, indicating that individuals, were prior to competition in some sort of energy deficit. But of course, this study didn't do an assessment of performance. There's no way to know whether they did well or not. I mean, these are like top athletes competing for the Olympic trials. And what's the effect on skeletal muscle, which you might agree is quite important for performance. So let's look at other evidence maybe to reflect on this a little bit. So this is a case study that I'm presenting here that we published last year, following up Tour de France female athlete competing the Tour de France Femmes in 2023. And it fits well, the story or the evidence that we might need to see whether being in some sort of energy deficit is incompatible with like top elite athletic performances. So this athlete was a cyclist and an all-rounder. I know it's not a runner, sorry, I don't have that data for that with a runner, but I think it's applicable to what we're discussing here. Prior to this assessment, the athlete reported with oligomenorrhea and low T3, which are thought as markers of potentially chronic low energy availability. And we did an assessment of total daily energy expenditure with double-labeled water, and we did an assessment of energy intake with a methodology called the remote food photography method. When we go to the results, as you would expect, this athlete completed the 8 stages of the race, racing hard between 3 and 5 hours per stage, typically at a relatively high intensity. And you can see here in this figure the main results of the study, where it delineates the total daily energy expenditure on that top line, like dash line at the top. We can only get an average over the whole competition. And then on the bars, we see the energy intake in calories per day, and the dots are the body mass of the athlete. So you can see that the average energy expenditure for this athlete was 7,572 calories, so quite high energy expenditure. I think it's the highest energy expenditure reported for a female athlete in the literature. And you can see that she was unable to match the energy expenditure with the energy intake throughout this period with a over 2,300 calories energy deficit per day. This is despite ingesting nearly 14 grams of carbohydrates per kilo per day, so nearly a kilo of carbohydrates ingestion per day. This is quite important, and you will see in heavy stock how important carbohydrates are for performance. This athlete was basically hitting the target in terms of carbohydrate intake for competition. Now, what is interesting to see in terms of performance, this is complicated because this athlete is an all-rounder, is not going for the win of the race, is helping someone else. But we have power data for this athlete, and we see that by the end of the race, this energy deficit led to nearly 2 kilos of weight loss, and her mean maximal power throughout the race was on stage 7. And her best performance during a time trial, she's a time trialist, was on stage number 8. So when she was facing a lot of energy deficit. Moreover, 2 weeks after this, she went on to compete in the individual time trials World Championships, where she placed number 10. So would she have done better if she had had more food and she didn't lose this amount of body mass? We don't really know, but what we know is that at least a degree of energy deficit, allegedly chronic and for sure acute, is compatible with top athletic performances. Now let's think a little bit about what's happening in skeletal muscle in this situation. So we know skeletal muscle is quite a big part of our bodies, around 40% of body mass, depending on the population that we're looking into. And it's key for locomotion and regulation of whole body metabolism. So we know that if we put someone in some sort of energy deficit, they lose body mass, not only of fat mass, but also there's some sort of muscle loss. And this general idea that if there's a loss of muscle, there's also a loss of functional capacity, and the metabolic benefits or metabolic effects might be compromised as well. But maybe this is not so much like that. Let's look at this study that is done in rodents. I don't think necessarily rodent studies are the best model for humans, but we're going to look at this study in rodents, and then we're going to look at some data that we have from my lab in humans. In this study, they looked at the effect of energy deficit with or without exercise in the characteristics of skeletal muscle in mice, and performance in running in a little mouse treadmill. So this study was an 8-week study where they had a control group, an alternate day fasting as a way of inducing energy deficit, an exercise group, or a group with exercise plus alternate day fasting. As you would expect, the energy intake was lower in the alternate day fasting throughout those 8 weeks, but there was no changes in body weight in the different groups. When they look at markers of mitochondrial biogenesis, mitochondria, for the ones of you that are not familiar exactly what they are, they're a very important organelle for generating energy aerobically in the muscle cell. There were increased markers of mitochondrial biogenesis in the groups that did exercise versus the groups that didn't do exercise, of course, as you would expect, but also the alternate day fasting increased markers of mitochondrial biogenesis in muscle, apparently having a positive effect in the capacity of muscle of generating energy. And when you look at the performance in these mice, the performance was improved in the group that had a degree of energy deficit compared to the one that didn't, seemingly energy deficit having an effect on improving performance in this case. Now let's look at a little bit what happens in humans in terms of the skeletal muscle oxidative machinery, and this is unpublished data from my lab, a study that hopefully is going to be submitted for publication soon. In this study, we exposed individuals to 3 5-day periods whereby they were first in 5 days of free living conditions, or they were in 5 days of energy balance, or they were in 5 days of energy deficit with an energy availability that was 22% of the energy availability in the energy balance period, so 78% reduction in energy availability, so it's quite pronounced. While they kept exercising throughout those 5-day periods, they were exercising on bikes, again, they were not running, easier to control, we did everything in the lab, everything was controlled, all the food was provided. We took blood samples throughout this period, and we took muscle samples before and after each 5-day period. In muscle, the main outcome measure is this thing called dynamic proteomic profiling. So we did a proteomic analysis whereby we can look at abundance of individual proteins in muscle, as well as turnover of proteins in muscle. We were giving to these individuals deuterated water, D2O, as a way of we can see how fast the proteins are being synthesized. In terms of results, first of all, our intervention had the desired effect. So in the period of 5 days of free living and energy balance, there was no changes in body mass or any changes in body composition. And in the energy deficit period, there was a decrease of nearly 3 kilos, was about 1 kilo of fat mass. As you would expect, there's also a decrease in leptin, which is a strong indicator of the body sort of responding to this energy deficit intervention. And there was also a decrease in markers that are thought as also markers of low energy availability, like IGF-1, T3, B1 and well, glycogen, which is indicating the amount of carbohydrates or the availability of carbohydrates in the muscle. As you would expect, also there was an increase in circulating free fatty acids and an increase in fat oxidation during exercise and at rest. There was also the individuals here enter into a little bit of ketosis as well. So let's look at what's happening in skeletal muscle. We measured the turnover of like 625 different proteins and the abundance of nearly 1,500 proteins. When we break down the proteins in like different pools for like the turnover, so we look at the soluble proteins, so the proteins that are sort of floating around in the cell, in the sarcoplasma. Then we have the myofibrillary proteins, which are like the contractile apparatus of muscle, and then we have the mitochondrial proteins. There was no changes in the protein synthesis of either the soluble or myofibrillary proteins, but there was an increase in the mitochondrial fraction of proteins in the energy deficit intervention only. Then we look at the abundance of data. What you see there on panels A and B, each line is one protein for, in the panel A, the proteins of the electron transport chain, and on panel B is proteins of the beta oxidation and tricarboxylic acid cycle, so the Krebs cycle. And there was also a nice correlation between the difference that we saw in turnover and abundance of protein. So the message is quite clear. You know, it seems that adding energy deficit to already existing exercise stimulus further increases the amount of mitochondrial proteins. So this is in line with the idea proposed that maybe when there's not enough energy available to maintain all physiological systems working normally, there's a reallocation of energy toward things that might be more important for immediate survival. If we think that we're hunter-gatherers, possibly chasing game and gathering food is being quite important for survival because it's the only way for us to procure food. So sacrificing that capacity is probably not the best or the smartest way to stay alive in the wild, but that maybe represents that the energy being sort of allocated to these functions might be also represented by downregulating the energy to some other physiological functions that are not immediately necessary for survival, such as reproductive function and maybe bone metabolism. So then this brings us to ask the question, what is energy balance necessarily a good thing or a bad thing? Well, maybe it's not as easy to say like things are like black and white like that. And brings us to the third point of this talk, which are the concerns beyond energy deficit. So we see in this model low energy availability. In the Brett's model, low energy availability is the sole cause of all these sort of negative consequences. However, when we start thinking about other things that are not energy availability, another picture arises, and I think maybe focusing on only one cause leads to bias. And I really like the quote from the great psychologist Abraham Maslow that says, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you think like low energy availability is only the cause of all these problems, then that's what you're going to find. But when you start looking at other things that might be causing similar effects that are stressors that are faced by athletes, then you can see that maybe the picture is a little bit different. For example, psychological stress has been shown to clearly affect reproductive function in females. There's also been shown that stress affects testosterone concentration. And this, I'm just like citing some studies here without doing an exhaustive literature reference list on this topic. Also, bone metabolism is affected by stress. Similarly, overtraining or training a lot without proper recovery leads to very similar endocrine disruptions as low energy availability does, and also some endocrine axes are also affected by sleep deprivation. So all these stressors may coexist, and it might not be necessarily that only low energy availability is the only factor that athletes face in the day-to-day. So I think we need to move beyond a unicentric model, and a group of researchers and myself have recently published a critical analysis of the REDS model titled "Does the Relative Energy Deficiency Sport Syndrome Exist?", published in the journal Sports Medicine in September last year, whereby we propose that it's not just low energy availability that can cause all these negative consequences, but it's probably a sum of different factors, such as training, environmental factors, mental health, disordered eating, and eating disorders which are aligned with like mental health, not only nutrition. Nutrition, of course, low energy availability is an important factor, sleep and infection and other undiagnosed conditions. So we think that possibly we need to think not in like focusing in low energy availability, but think about all the different stressors following the idea of an allostatic load model. An allostatic load model, so if you ever heard the word stress used in something that is not engineering, that word that has become part of the medical lingo is thanks to the work of these guys, Hans Selye, which basically proposed this thing called the general adaptation syndrome in the 40s by work he started in the early 20th century, basically indicating that or suggesting that there's some sort of unspecific response to a number of stressors. And this model was further developed by Bruce McEwen, who proposed the allostatic load model, where he basically suggests that the central nervous system plays a key role in determining what is a stressor and to what extent this stressor is stressing the system, providing a response to the environment. Therefore, we think that applying this model is probably a more like holistic and balanced way of assessing the needs of an athlete by thinking low energy availability as one stressor among many. And of course, like any stressor, like training or like any other thing that generates a stimulus, if you do too much of it without enough rest from it, it might have a negative effect. So with this in mind, then I think we need to be a little bit more balanced in general of like thinking low energy availability as bad or good, or energy balance as bad or good, and be more integrative in our looks. So I'm going to conclude today by outlining and reading verbatim from screen 5 different key points from today. Point number 1 is that prominent health concerns in runners such as bone stress injuries and reproductive system dysfunctions have been associated to low energy availability with a degree of mechanistic data supporting it. Point number 2, short-term mechanistic data supports causal effect of low energy availability, but many other purported effects of LEA are based on observational data. Point number 3, a degree of low energy availability may result in some adaptive benefits, especially in skeletal muscle. We need more work on this to be sure that that's the case. Point number 4, many of the consequences of the REDS model can also be attributed to several other stressors that are not low energy availability and may coexist with it. And finally, nutritional and non-nutritional stressors should be considered synergistic and potentially adaptive or maladaptive for health and performance. That's all for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose. My question, and I know it's a difficult one to answer, and probably don't have it, or anyone in the room really, but I wanted to ask you, probe you a bit about your perspective on how to measure allostatic load, something we deal a lot in our work.
Yeah, if you have a few £1 million to give us for research, I'll happily answer that question. So in that paper that we wrote, we proposed a number of questionnaires that you might use for an athlete to point towards what area of, the potential areas that need that need to be taken care of can be assessed. This is sort of, personally for me, is ongoing work on trying to see how we can actually best do this. I think, my work has been very energy-centric, and I'm opening my eyes myself to this whole viewpoint. And we know that there's a lot of work to do with a lot of potential, but at the time, rather other than this list, is called the AHARC, the list of questionnaires, basically to assess the athlete, as what you're asking. Other than that, we don't yet have a system where you can numerically say you score this many points here and those many points there, and therefore you're at risk of something. I think I'm trying to stay away from that at the minute, because I think that creates a little bit of a problem if it's not done properly. But this is something that we would like to do more work on.
Right, we'll do one more question. We're right on time, so I'm keen to. Oh, there's one over here.
Thank you very much. It's a really good talk. I was wondering, does your research, you think, suggest that doing an element of fasted training could be a benefit? Because I know a lot of research recently has said against fasted training, and you can get benefit from training at a higher intensity with kind of fuel, just with the kind of mitochondrial upregulation. Is there anything in that, do you think?
Yeah, there's been, over the years, there's been quite a bit of work, more than on fasted training, on training with low muscle glycogen. So there's quite a bit of evidence showing that the response of muscle training, at least the acute response to exercise of training with low muscle glycogen stores, leads to the upregulation of pathways associated to fat metabolism and potentially mitochondrial biogenesis as well. Whether that's acute response to the low energy in the sort of micromilieu of the muscle cell, or a response of the systemic response to low energy availability, there's not really a lot of clarity on that. When we're talking about low energy availability, generally what we're talking about is days of exposure, of not having enough energy, rather than that sort of acute effect of not training with enough energy. But there might be a role of that as well, in terms of time-restricted eating and training fasted and so on. There's not a whole lot of data on that and showing how it might actually improve performance or adaptation to training.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much, Jose.